Welcome back to the Earth and Environmental Systems podcast from the Colorado School of Mines. I am your host, Dr. Christian Shorey.
Electric Avenue, and then we'll take it higher. Who is to blame in what country? Never can get to the one. Dealing in multiplication, and they still can't feed everyone. Oh no, we're gonna rock down to Electric Avenue, and then we'll take it higher. Oh no, we're gonna rock down to Electric Avenue, and then we'll take it higher.
I think I'm getting the black lung, Bob. It's not very well ventilated down there.
For Christ's sake, Derek, you've been down there one day. Talk to me in 30 years.
This is my wind-up Godzilla toy. It rolls along shooting sparks out of its mouth and is about to fall over the edge of my desk. Whoa! But what makes it go? Where does its energy come from? Well, there's a spring inside with stored potential energy, and that stored energy is being released as the spring expands and drives the kinetic energy that results in the movement of Godzilla and the creation of the little sparks out of its mouth. But where did that spring get its energy? Well, easy answer. I wound it up with my hand. Where did my hand get the kinetic energy to move the spring? It was stored as chemical energy in the muscles. Where did the muscles get the energy? I ate my turkey sandwich for lunch, and there was chemical potential energy stored in the meat, cheese, and bread. The turkey and the cow, which produced the milk for the cheese, were both primary consumers, eating some producer organism, and the bread is directly made from producers, and all producers involved in making my sandwich, directly or indirectly, got their energy from the sun. So, what made Godzilla move? Solar energy, which is a form of nuclear fusion. But then Godzilla hit the edge of the desk and fell, accelerating at about 9.81 meters per second squared. That is an increase in kinetic energy. Where did that energy come from? Well, stored potentially from gravity, is gravitational potential energy. But, okay, the real Godzilla was born out of a volcano or something like that, which might make us wonder where the energy for a volcano comes from. In that case, it is the radioactive fissioning of heavy elements inside the Earth. Anytime you see energy, stored or in action, that is, potential or kinetic, and you ask where that energy came from, you are ultimately led to one of the three basic sources of energy: solar fusion, gravitation, and geothermal fissioning. This can confuse discussions on some issues surrounding energy resources, such as when people think that electricity is clean energy and will not contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. Electricity is generated in turbines that are driven by some other source of energy, and the principal source in my neck of the woods is coal. So running my computer to do this podcast means that I am making a demand on coal consumption, not just electricity. And so I'm putting out hot air in more ways than one. All right. In the biomimicry section of our last lecture, we put aside the question of how will we harness energy. And obviously we are going to discuss that today. But human energy consumption is just a subcategory of what we refer to as resource consumption. We have energy resources and material resources used by humanity, and I want to hit on some basic concepts involved with resource consumption. First off is the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources. The concept of a renewable resource is a little odd because a resource can be reformed and still not be considered renewable. A resource is considered renewable only if it can be recreated within human timescales, generally less than 100 years. So, trees are renewable resources, as I've heard Rush Limbaugh point out, but what Rush missed is that if you cut them down faster than they regrow, they can still be depleted. So there's a sustainable yield for renewable resources. Now, I mentioned before that forests transpire so much water into the atmosphere that they can recycle precipitation and even create invisible moisture mountains that cause air to ramp up and drop more moisture as precipitation. So when a forest is removed because it is harvested faster than it regrows, that is, it's harvested over its sustainable yield, the area of the forest and areas downwind can dry out and turn to grassland, or even go through full-out desertification, as we mentioned before. So even when we call something renewable, it can be harvested faster than it is renewed, and thus be depleted, and maybe even cause further ecological damage. But if a resource is non-renewable, any use will draw down stores of that resource. Resources are also categorized by their overall abundance, our knowledge about their existence, and our ability, both technologically and economically, to extract them. We can break resources into discovered and undiscovered categories, and further break them down by our technological and economic ability to extract them. There are discovered iron and nickel resources in the asteroid belt, and plenty of undiscovered ones as well, I'm sure. But we simply do not have the technology at present to extract and use those resources. So when a resource lays below a technological threshold for use, they are referred to as non-recoverable resources. The iron and nickel in asteroids are a non-recoverable resource at this time. Gold dissolved into the oceans or fresh water locked up in icebergs is within our technological abilities to extract, but is simply not economically worthwhile. These recoverable but economically unviable resources are referred to as recoverable resources. If a resource has been found that may be economically worthwhile to extract, but its full extent has not been measured, like the frozen methane hydrates on the ocean floors, it is referred to as a known resource. And if the resource is economically worthwhile, located, and measured, it is a proven resource. On the other hand, if we know a resource must exist but we have not yet located it, it is an undiscovered resource, also known as a hypothetical, speculative, or inferred resource. And the last category of resources are the ones that we simply haven't realized the use of yet, or have not seen at all. These are the unconceived resources. As we discuss energy resources, these varying categories will come into play. So continuing from our biomimicry standpoint, we must first ask if our current methods are broken before we want to fix them. Now, seeing as fossil fuels are the primary source of energy today, and it is the use of fossil fuels that is the primary cause of global warming, and you climate change deniers out there can refer to my climate lectures for the justification on that statement, I think it's reasonable to say that we may want to fix the current way of fueling our economy. The dependence on fossil fuels also leads to ocean acidification and is a significant player in modern geopolitical tensions. Now, if we are to mimic the natural system, we should look to where the biosphere gets its energy. As has been noted many times in our lectures, the majority of the energy that drives natural ecosystems is solar energy. But humans aren't plants, so it is instructive to go through some of the history of energy use by humans before we jump full into a biomimicry standpoint. And then we want to look at the various ways that we can extract energy from our environment before we say we need to go completely solar. Throughout most of human history, our major energy source, not counting food sources, was biomass, specifically wood, which is just one step removed from solar. Wood is categorized as a proven renewable resource and is assured as long as it is not depleted faster than it is regrown, as mentioned above. However, following the Black Death, the plague in Europe, as the Little Ice Age began to grip the region starting in the 1400s, and human populations began to rebound from the plague, so too did the demand for heating fuel. So as more and more people populated Western Europe in the 1500s to 1700s, forests began to disappear across the European continent. What saved the day for the forests was coal, a fossil fuel. Coal use began to rise in the 1850s and surpassed wood as our primary source of energy in the 1880s. Coal formation starts in places where a large amount of plant material is buried without being decomposed. It starts as peat and then gets buried, heated, and pressured to become low-grade lignite coal. With more heat and pressure, it becomes bituminous coal, and then finally anthracite. And obviously, this is occurring on the world all the time. However, it takes so long for this coal to be formed that it is considered a non-renewable resource. The conversion of peat to lignite to bituminous to anthracite involves the expulsion of water and the increase in the relative amount of fixed carbon to volatiles. Generally, the lower grade coals also contain a higher proportion of sulfur and nitrogen, whose emission can result in acid rain. The lower grades also have other potentially hazardous materials such as heavy metals like mercury. We have, over the past 150 years, extracted most of the anthracite and bituminous coal, and are now left with mostly low-grade lignite reserves. Now, coal was king until the mid-20th century when oil took over as our primary energy source, and that ranking has continued until today. Now, oil is usually refined down to make gasoline, but there are other hydrocarbons that can be extracted from oil as well, and we're not going to go fully into that. From a greenhouse gas standpoint, this was a relatively good turn, as burning oil releases about half the CO2 as coal for the same energy output. Besides oil and coal, we also have another fossil fuel known as natural gas. Natural gas is mostly methane, but it does also contain the heavier hydrocarbons ethane, propane, butane, and pentane, along with carbon dioxide, hydrogen, helium, and hydrogen sulfide. Before natural gas makes it to the consumer, the impurities are stripped out until you have pure methane. Now, methane is colorless and odorless, which can pose a danger if a leak occurs, so an odorant like methyl mercaptan is added to give that lovely rotting cabbage smell, which makes leak detection easier. I guess if they made the smell something nicer like apple pie, you wouldn't be able to tell if Grandma was baking or about to blow up, so you put in something that smells like rotting cabbage. Anyway, leak detection is important for a few reasons. Methane, in and of itself, is not toxic, but it can be an asphyxiant if it displaces enough air. In open space, this is unlikely to occur, as methane is lighter than air, so it dissipates up into the atmosphere, but in closed spaces it can build up and suffocate breathing organisms. It can also explode under the right conditions, and those right conditions being that natural gas concentrations have to be between 5 and 15%. Below 5%, there just isn't enough natural gas to ignite in a chain reaction to explode. Above 15%, there isn't enough oxygen for continued combustion. Another issue with natural gas leaks is the addition of methane, a greenhouse gas more potent than CO2, to the atmosphere. Though burning of natural gas produces less CO2 per unit of energy than either coal or oil, it's about 56% of the greenhouse gas of burning coal and about 71% that of oil. The problem comes with fugitive gas leaks into the atmosphere. It's been estimated that if over 1 to 2% of the natural gas being produced and transported escaped to the atmosphere before combustion, then the methane greenhouse gas effect from that would be greater than the CO2 greenhouse effect due to our current oil consumption. So natural gas also has transportation issues due to its low density. The best transport method is through pipelines, but this is impractical overseas. The world's largest natural gas field is Qatar's offshore North Field, but getting it from there to where it is used is a major challenge. Some solutions are making LNG, liquefied natural gas, or transporting it as CNG, compressed natural gas. Each require further energy consumption to liquefy or compress before transport and then gasify or decompress at the destination, so it's not optimal, but it is one solution. The pipelines that we talked about also have limitations, as they can only transport a limited amount of gas. Recently, politicians in colder regions of North America have been grumbling about the potential shortage in natural gas. In reality, there is no shortage of reserves in these areas, just a limitation in the ability of existing pipelines to transport the gas. Natural gas frequently comes out of the ground along with oil, and in the old days it was merely flared off, that is, burned. Now, that's an illegal practice in most countries today. More often these days, what we do is take the natural gas that we can't transport and re-inject it into the reservoir. Now, this has a dual benefit of keeping the pressure on the oil field high, thus enhancing recovery of oil, and storing the natural gas until it is needed later on. However, coal, oil, and natural gas, collectively known as the fossil fuels, simply are not renewable, and their use is the major contributor to the increase in greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Plus, there are major environmental and work hazards involved with their extraction as well. Coal mining is especially nasty in this regard. Besides the acid rain and the greenhouse gas emissions, coal mining has the drawbacks of making large amounts of fly ash, which can be up to 20% of the coal's original volume and contain high concentrations of heavy metals like mercury and other contaminants. Coal mines can cause land degradation, either through the practice of strip mining or surface subsidence due to the collapse of abandoned underground mines. And, of course, there are the health risks to coal miners, such as black lung and silicosis. The most obvious risks come from mine collapse and flooding, and the Colorado School of Mines, where I teach, is always particularly sensitive to such mining disasters. The recent Sago Mine and the Crandall Canyon Mine disasters put a real pall on our campus, as many of our community have been involved on both the victim and rescuer sides of these disasters. But the U.S. actually has a relatively safe mining record compared to other areas, like China. Now, China has about 50 times more coal miners than the U.S., but the number of fatalities in China's coal mining industry is much higher than 50 times that of the U.S. For example, in 2004, there were 28 fatal coal mining accidents in the United States, a number that we in the mining community find way too high. Of course, we would prefer to lose 0 miners a year. But if numbers were proportional in China, we would expect the 2004 death toll to be around 1,400 people in China killed in coal mining accidents. In actuality, the year 2004 saw a total of 6,027 deaths in Chinese coal mining accidents. With China currently putting 1.5 coal-fired power plants online per week, the demand is steadily increasing, which puts further pressure on coal mine operators to overwork their miners in increasingly dangerous situations. There are also national and global security issues at play here, which is a particularly strong issue at play in my country of the United States. It's been said that the U.S. is addicted to oil like an alcoholic to alcohol, and the biggest liquor store is in the worst neighborhood of town. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, is comprised of Algeria, Angola, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Venezuela, and Ecuador, which recently rejoined OPEC in November of 2007. Many of these countries have shown hostility towards many of the industrialized nations in the past, and some are areas of great political instability or known human rights violations. As I record this podcast, the price of oil just recently hit an all-time high of $109 per barrel. The recent rise in oil prices is due in no small part to the rapidly developing countries of India and China expanding their economies and putting an increased demand on oil supply. In a previous podcast, we mentioned that China recently became the #1 carbon emitter, and the gap between China and the United States, in second place, continues to rise. Even if we relieve our dependence on foreign oil by tapping into our lower-grade coal reserves, our natural gas reservoirs, and our alternative fossil fuels, the oil shales and the tar sands, we still don't solve the carbon emission issue. Not without some major technological changes like carbon sequestration, which is something we definitely need to look into. And we also increase the hazards to miners, the environments, and the communities where mining occurs. So right now, the petrochemical industry is beginning to look ever more carefully at frozen methane hydrates at the bottom of our oceans for a possible fuel source. Success in the clathrate hydrate mining techniques would certainly solve our energy supply problem for a long time out, but it would wildly exacerbate the problem of greenhouse gas accumulation in our atmosphere. The potential loss of biodiversity due to the climate disruption we project from current energy consumption is dire enough without kicking it into hyper-overdrive by developing methane at the ocean bottoms. Maybe in the future we can genetically engineer microbes that eat atmospheric carbon and convert it to something more useful and remove this greenhouse gas barrier. Or maybe we will be really good at carbon sequestration in the future. And we should certainly push for such advancements and never discount the possibility that we may be able to tap into these fossil fuel resources in a more environmentally sound way in the future. But for now, it seems unwise to look to more fossil fuels to run our economy. And ultimately, it's not renewable. So we're going to have to ultimately find something else. So before looking to alternatives, though, we should point out that maximizing conservation and efficiency should really be the first step, and it will go far. I've heard an estimate from an energy company executive that if the United States citizens would all get their cars tuned and inflate their tires to the proper pressure, we would, in 1 year, conserve the amount of oil that lays beneath ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That's the wildlife refuge in Alaska whose restrictions the Bush administration and politicians in Alaska tried so hard to get removed so as to allow oil drilling and piping. When you look at the oil crisis of the 1970s, you see that we were able to conserve when pressed. Maybe we should think about conserving even when we are not being squeezed. That being said, there are other sources of energy available, referred to as alternative energy sources, because they are alternative to fossil fuels. And we should look at those, but always keep in mind conservation and efficiency should underlie any alternative strategy as well. All right, so some of these alternatives are also non-renewable, such as nuclear, and it is nuclear, not nuclear, or geothermal, and others are renewable, such as solar, wind, hydropower, biomass. So let's start off with the non-renewables. Start off with nuclear. Now, nuclear power has a really bad name in environmental circles, but it is actually a pretty good alternative fuel source right now. It's a great alternative to fossil fuels. The safety issues many opponents often point to have been minimized over the years. Okay, Chernobyl was a very bad accident, but such poorly designed reactors are no longer online, and the new generation of reactors have many more safety backup systems. As for the accident that occurred at 3 Mile Island in the United States that really started the environmental backlash to nuclear power, it was the most significant nuclear accident in United States history, and no one was killed or even injured. Now, obviously, we don't want to say that safety is not an issue. I don't mean to play this down, but it is not the huge threat that we are often led to believe it is. What we really need to focus on is the waste product, the fission products of nuclear fission, because they are radioactive, and they'll be radioactive for a long time, and they can cause definite health issues if not properly stored. Several of what are known as fourth-generation reactors, now in the developmental phase, are focused on waste recycling. That is, taking the fission waste products and actually putting them back in for a second round to further use them in the reactions to generate energy. Techniques such as gas-cooled fast reactors, lead-cooled fast reactors, molten salt reactors, sodium-cooled fast reactors, and supercritical water-cooled reactors all apply this waste recycling to minimize the ultimate output of nuclear waste. To get these more efficient reactors online will require some more research into heat and or corrosion-resistant materials, but it seems worthwhile to invest in such research goals to help remove our dependence on fossil fuels until a cleaner and more sustainable method can be used. Now, all these reactors I just mentioned are fission reactors. That means they're non-renewable energy source that require unstable heavy elements that split into lighter elements while releasing energy formerly stored in the nuclear bonds. There's another type of nuclear energy source, and that would be fusion, in which lighter elements are fused together to make heavier elements while releasing energy in the reaction. This is the type of energy generated by the sun. The supply of light elements, such as isotopes of hydrogen, protium, deuterium, or tritium, are much more abundant than for the heavy elements needed for fission, and renewable, and they can be made by various methods. So they're renewable for the reason that you can make them from other renewable resources like solar or wind, as we'll talk about later. And the waste product is just various isotopes of helium, which are harmless to life and have no greenhouse effect at all. Fusion also has the added benefit of safety, whereas a fission reactor can stay hot for days after shutdown, while the fission products continue to fission again by beta decay, thus adding to the potential for meltdown. A fusion reaction depends on exact conditions of temperature, pressure, and magnetic field conditions, so that if anything went wrong, the needed conditions would be disturbed and the reaction would cease immediately. Unfortunately, here on Earth, we put more energy in to make the fusion reaction occur in a controlled manner than we get out. But that may change pretty soon. The International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, the original name was dropped because people didn't like the word thermonuclear, especially when placed next to experimental. But ITER is a project to build a tokamak reactor. That is a reactor that uses magnetic fields to contain the plasma for the fusion reaction, with the goal of proving the technology to produce at least 10 times the break-even energy input for at least 400 seconds. The international partners working on the project do hope to be up and running in about 8 years, in 2016, in the south of France. From this experiment, the goal is to construct a larger facility that for now is being called DEMO, D-E-M-O, for Demonstration Power Plant, which has the goal of producing 25 times the break-even input power for extended periods of time starting around 2033. Though purists would point out that this is not really a biomimetic solution, it is a solar mimetic solution which holds great promise. But we don't want to place all our eggs in one basket. And climate models tell us we really don't want to continue business as usual fossil fuel burning until 2033. So we need to look at some of the other baskets in which we can place our eggs. The other non-renewable alternative resource is geothermal. And I say it is non-renewable, but this depends on the location. Some areas can draw down the thermal energy from underlying rock faster than it is replenished, which would make it technically non-renewable. But other areas have heat flux high enough to make this a truly sustainable energy source. Geothermal works best for places with magma near the surface with high thermal flux, but you can apply geothermal in other places due to what's known as the geothermal gradient. This is the increase of temperature with depth in the earth, and though it varies widely from place to place and changes with depth, it averages about 1 degree Fahrenheit per 100 feet, or about 0.01 to 0.02 degrees Celsius per meter. So, if you drill down about 6 kilometers and pump water down at high pressure, the high-pressure water will fracture the rock and then seep through the cracks of these hot rocks, extracting the heat from the rocks. This hot water is then recaptured by another pipe that pulls the water back up to the surface, where steam can be used to drive turbines to produce electricity. Or maybe the hot water can directly go to heat homes in the area. The major advantages of geothermal are cost competitiveness, once startup costs have been recouped, the lack of greenhouse gas emission or radioactive waste, the potential sustainability of the system, if it is sustainable, and the fact that energy production is not influenced by the vagaries of weather, as many of the other alternatives will be, as we'll see. Energy production can continue both day and night, making it what is known as a base load power supply. Obviously, things like solar don't continue day and night, it's only during the day. And as with all the alternatives that we were going to be talking about, it reduces our dependence on fossil fuels and all the price fluctuations and political strife that comes with depending on fossil fuels. Now, I'm just going to leave that as an implied for all the remaining alternatives that we discuss. You know, it's reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. Now, the problems involved with geothermal are that you can extract the heat more rapidly than it reaccumulates, and thus can drain the heat reservoir. So it can be non-renewable in that case. There are very high startup costs involved. You have to dispose of the wastewater in an environmentally sensitive way, and there are a few really appropriate areas to do this kind of geothermal energy work, mainly where magma is near the surface. And such places tend to be tectonically active, too, and that can cause fracturing of your piping if they cross active fault zones. And the main issue, though, is the limited amount of power available. Right now, less than 1% of our energy consumption for all humans on the planet is met by geothermal, at about 140 megawatts. And estimates are that we could perhaps increase this to 1,700 megawatts with current technology over the next 100 years. That doesn't come close to solving worldwide energy supply problems. But locally, there are some places where it does pay off when done right, such as Iceland. That's a place that uses geothermal and to a great advantage. There's a place in Western Australia, and this Western Australia example is pretty cool. It's driven by the radioactive decay of uranium-rich concentrations in the granite below the surface. And that shows us that geothermal, in all its forms, is basically tapping the energy from natural nuclear fission reactors, the internal fissioning inside the Earth. The total potential of geothermal energy, if technological advances and infrastructure investment were to increase substantially, could supply our energy needs for millennia to come. The energy is there, but it will take tremendous amounts of work to figure out how to properly harness it and deliver it, and do it in an environmentally sensitive and sustainable way. So, nuclear fission, non-renewable. Nuclear fusion, not going to be ready for some time to come. Geothermal is only sometimes renewable, and with current technology is simply not abundant enough to meet global needs. So this guides us to looking at those truly renewable alternative energy sources as a major potential solution for our economic future. First, we want to look at wind power. Using wind to perform work is certainly not a new technology. Windmills have been widely used to grind grain and pump water for almost 1,000 years. And we know a windmill was used to power an organ in the 1st century AD, so it's about 2,000 years old at least. But the modern use is primarily to convert wind energy into a more useful form of energy, such as electricity. The dominant modern wind power instrument is the 3-bladed wind turbine, which directly generates electricity. You might have seen some of these while driving around your country. This particular design minimizes the amount of metal fatigue, which has hampered many other designs, as the metal fatigues from wind fluctuations. Eventually the parts break, and your turbine can fall apart. Because wind speed increases rapidly from the ground with altitude, the blades are placed atop a high tower to catch these higher winds. And the most modern design has the blades downwind from the tower, which helps with a problem encountered when the blades are upwind and flex with strong wind to the point where the blades actually flex back and clip the tower, causing damage to both. One of the things that had to be done before we could put the blades downwind was to deal with a thumping issue. Wind that goes around the tower causes turbulence there, and as the blades go through that turbulent spot, it can cause this thumping that can set up resonance and break the tower apart. So they had to do some aerodynamic designing on these towers. Now, these modern designs also incorporate what are called jointed blades that are allowed to flex with the wind or rotate to reduce fatigue forces. So along with all other wind turbine designs, we have about 1% of electricity being produced by wind power today. Of electricity. The total energy production is only about 0.3%. The source of this energy is solar energy converted to atmospheric motion. As discussed in our weather lectures, the Earth is differentially heated, and both ocean currents and atmospheric motion act to redistribute the heat from the equator to the poles. So wind, the atmospheric motion, is a form of kinetic energy that is renewable, clean, plentiful, and widely distributed. The main problem facing wind power is its variability, and it varies on hourly and seasonal timescales. There are also annual variations, but those tend to be insignificant when we calculate power generation over long periods of time. Now, if wind power is used only on small scales for local communities or maybe a single building or something like that, the intermittency is rarely a big problem. It's when a large sector of the electrical generation is based on wind that wind's usefulness can be limited. This can be remediated by energy storage solutions. There's one called pumped storage hydroelectricity, which uses high winds to pump water uphill to a storage reservoir that can then be allowed to flow back downhill, driving a hydroelectric turbine when the wind is low, so that a more constant electrical base is maintained. There's also grid energy storage, which puts electricity into the grid, and the grid can act like a very large distributed battery that stores the electricity until it is needed. Electricity generated from any source can also be used to strip hydrogen from water, which can then be directly burned or used in a fuel cell, which we want to discuss that in a little bit. If wind power is used in conjunction with solar, the variability problem is usually decreased due to the inverse correlation of sun and wind. That is, if the wind isn't blowing, it is most likely a stable high-pressure air mass on top of you, and so the sun is probably shining. Whereas if the wind is blowing hard, it's probably a frontal issue, and therefore you have clouds and the sun is not shining. So solar and wind tend to be inversely correlated in their strength. Now, a common environmental complaint about wind turbines is their ability to act as bird blenders. Several studies have actually shown that this is not a really big concern. So if you've heard that wind turbines knock out birds, especially migratory birds, it takes about 30 turbines to kill one more bird per year from the studies that have been done. So all the turbines in the United States, all the wind turbines, probably contribute to about 40,000 more bird deaths per year. Compared to the hundreds of millions of birds killed each year due to cats, wind power is definitely not a bird's biggest concern. Bats, on the other hand, seem to be worse off. This is especially true for migratory bat species. But even in this case with bats, the effect does not seem to pose any insurmountable threat of extinction, at least not in any cases I've heard of, and so shouldn't be considered a major obstacle to developing more wind power. There are some other risks with turbines, such as environmental disturbance during construction, especially on these offshore wind farms. Sometimes there's failure of the braking mechanism, which leads to uncontrolled rotation, and the friction in an uncontrolled rotation of the blades ultimately leads to failure, fatigue failure, or even fire. Sometimes the friction causes these turbines to catch on fire. Towers can also catch on fire if they're struck by lightning, and towers do get struck by lightning somewhat frequently since they're standing up tall like that. There have been deaths due to construction mishaps, falling equipment from the towers, or falling ice from the wind turbines, from the blades. One parachutist was killed when he flew into the blades of a turbine. A small plane flew into a tower once. There have been some who blame what's called shadow flicker from the turbine blades for some car accidents. When the turbines are placed near highways, the shadow flicker can throw off drivers and cause accidents. Though wind power has resulted in a relatively high death rate per unit of power generation. There are about 4 times as many deaths per unit of power generation than that of hydropower. The statistic is based on a very small sample size, and as wind power production has increased, the overall fatalities have decreased. So again, this should not be a major obstacle to developing more wind power. Another renewable option just mentioned is hydropower. The hydrologic cycle, driven by solar radiation, lifts water by evaporation, thus increasing its gravitational potential energy, then drops it around the world when conditions are right, and when this water falls on highlands, the runoff component of the hydrologic cycle begins transforming the stored gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy. Water mills, like windmills, have been in use for centuries and allow us to transform the hydrologic kinetic energy into work. Now, due to the base flow of groundwater into streams that we mentioned in our groundwater lecture, hydropower does not vary as much with the weather as something like wind or solar. And we can create an even more consistent power output by building dams to store the water in reservoirs that drive turbines to generate electricity. The reliability of this form of power generation is evidenced by the solution to intermittent wind power mentioned above, where water is pumped up into a reservoir during high winds and then allowed to drive turbines when the wind is low. So hydroelectricity is a much more consistent energy base load. Now, right now, 3% of world energy production and about 19% of electricity production comes from hydropower. A recent study by the United States Department of Energy in 2004 estimated that only 40% of the total hydropower potential is being used in our country of the United States. Hydropower is not only renewable, but it also produces no CO2 or other greenhouse gases, and is often cheaper than electricity generated by fossil fuels. Reservoirs stored behind hydroelectric dams can also handle a fluctuating demand for energy. When demand is high, more water is allowed through the turbines, when demand falls, daily or seasonally it falls, water is simply stored behind the dam for later use. But we should not be so quick to build new dams on our rivers, as there are some quite serious environmental costs that accompany dam construction. First, we should note that there are already about 40,000 dams on rivers worldwide. There are very few streams in the world that run unimpeded to the ocean. And the amount of water held behind these 40,000 dams is enough to have actually caused a noticeable increase in the Earth's rotation rate. The reason for this is conservation of angular momentum. Just as the spinning skater bringing their arms in towards the axis of the rotation causes them to spin faster and faster, so an Earth that holds more of its water mass on land at mid to high latitudes, which is also closer to the axis of rotation, causes the Earth to spin faster. The Earth's rotation has sped up by 8 millionths of a second since 1950 due to this phenomenon. And though this is not a serious environmental problem, it is kind of interesting to note that this is the first measured instance of human activity influencing the Earth's motion. So our dam building has actually caused the Earth's motion to change. Now, the first real environmental problem associated with dams is the flooding of a terrestrial ecosystem. You build the dam, and then you flood the area behind it, and you have loss in animal or plant populations, and you lose cultural history that goes with it. It all goes underwater. A major benefit for dams is their ability to control flooding downstream, though. However, there's an environmental problem there too. The reduction of floods also disrupts the floodplain ecosystems downstream that are attuned to regular flooding. Reservoirs behind dams have a larger surface area exposed to the air and thus cause higher evaporation rates that cause loss of fresh water from a drainage basin area. So you'll have less water resources. And the evaporation increases the water's salinity. Sediment gets deposited in the reservoirs. We talked about lake siltation. The sediment being deposited in the reservoirs results in soil erosion downstream and even beach erosion where the stream enters the ocean with reduced sediment load. Dams disrupt breeding patterns of migratory fish. A lot of people have heard about the problem that salmon have spawning upstream when their path is blocked by dams. So when you disrupt the breeding patterns of migratory fish, you also disrupt the ecology of ecosystems that include such fish in their food webs. The slowing of water in these dammed up areas, in tropical areas, can allow more mosquito breeding. It's been shown that this has caused a spread of mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue fever or malaria or yellow fever. It can also allow the growth of more snails that carry the parasitizing flatworm that causes schistosomiasis. The slowing of the water also allows pollutants to concentrate in the water, as hydraulic pollutant flushing is diminished. Water downstream from the dam can not only become more saline and carry less sediment, but it can also change temperature, which can disturb an ecosystem. It can also lower its oxygen content, which will obviously disturb an ecosystem, an aquatic ecosystem. Because most dam outlets are near the bottom of the reservoir, that's where colder and less oxygenated water is. So you're releasing this colder, less oxygenated water downstream from the dam. Add up all these effects, they can have great impact on the organisms that are living downstream. Lastly, dams can trigger seismic activity, as mentioned in our earthquakes lecture. Building water pressure from filling a reservoir drives water into the ground and into fault zones where the increased pore pressure and lubrication can induce earthquakes. And though this has never caused serious problems to date, as the issues mentioned above have, we do have the Three Gorges Dam in China about to be completed and the reservoir behind it filled up, and we might see some interesting seismic activity when that one's completed. Now, before condemning all dams, I've listed a lot of environmental problems. We should also note that some dams create new wetland habitats which can actually increase bird populations. So well-designed dams with more natural discharge strategies can sometimes create enough positive outcomes that they outweigh some of the negative impacts. So my overall view is that hydropower generated by dam construction should be thought out carefully before being fully implemented. But in many places it would be preferable to just look for other power sources. Besides building dams, Other forms of water movement can be captured for various forms of energy generation. There are the small hydropower projects that are called run-of-river systems that only use part of the stream's energy without damming the river completely. The power generation is a lot smaller, but the ecological impacts are greatly reduced. So for areas that don't need really large energy supplies, it is a perfect compromise, these run-of-river small hydropower projects. Where the ocean meets the shore. Movement of ocean water in the form of tides and waves can be captured as well and turned to useful energy. Classic tidal power uses dams at estuaries where ocean water comes in during high tide and fresh water flushes out at low tide, or at gaps in bay mouth bars. These dams can run in both directions. The turbines there run in both directions. So both at high tide and low tide you have this very regular, sustainable energy generation. Regular but not consistent. So the drawbacks are that the estuaries are nurseries for many marine creatures and thus are very sensitive to disturbance. So you have to be incredibly careful if you're using an estuary for a tidal dam. And the power is coming in surges every, about 6 hours. And thus it is predictable, but it can't be matched to variations in power demand. So it's not a great base load supplier. Finally, there is the possibility of using wave energy, either by using these buoys that allow water to lift and lower the buoy in a way that generates electricity, or maybe having these cement columns where the waves as they pass displace the air and compress the air in these cement columns as the water passes by, the wave passes by. More energy can potentially be obtained from waves than from tides. And it is a more consistent energy source, but so far there have been some pretty big technical difficulties in trying to get this energy source fully realized. There's a new wave energy project off the coast of Scotland that is starting up this year, and will hopefully prove the potential of this energy source. Another renewable resource is biomass and biofuels. The use of plant material to extract energy does produce some greenhouse gases, but the amount released is typically the same amount that was extracted by the plant while it was photosynthesizing, thus making most biofuels and biomass energy what we call carbon neutral. Now, biomass is primarily the burning of plant tissue for heating, cooking, or boiling water to drive steam engines or drive turbines to generate electricity. About 4% of worldwide energy production comes from biomass. The major problem with biomass is that it often leads to deforestation, as wood is removed faster than it is regrown. With deforestation being a leading cause of biodiversity loss, it is obvious that we can't rely too much on biomass for our future sustainable energy production. There are also significant respiratory health problems from the use of biomass in homes with poor ventilation, where they're being used for cooking and heating. Now, there are some examples where biomass can be used to the benefit of a community and the environment, such as one great example I'm familiar with is the use of oat hulls from the Quaker Oats Company in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which were just being thrown out before, but they made a deal with the University of Iowa's electric generation plant, and they deliver those oat hulls over to the University of Iowa's power station, and they're fed into a boiler there, which runs the turbines to drive electricity for the University of Iowa. So that's a definite win-win solution, but it did require retrofitting of the power plant to allow this constant feed of oat hulls into their burner. The last major issue for biomass is that it does not have the energy density to make it practical for transportation fuel. But there are materials that can be extracted from biological materials which do have a higher energy density. Collectively, these are known as biofuels. There are 3 basic ways to get high energy density fuels from biomass, and they are biochemical, chemical, and thermochemical. Now, currently, the biochemical method is dominant in the United States, with the most common fuel produced being ethanol. The biochemical conversion method involves breaking biomass down into simple sugars that can then be fermented into a fuel such as ethanol. Unfortunately, ethanol has multiple problems at the moment in the United States. A study last summer showed that ethanol produces more ozone than gasoline. And remember that ozone is only good when it's produced up in the stratosphere. When it accumulates at ground level in the troposphere, it can lead to respiratory difficulties and damage plant and animal tissues. The major feedstock for ethanol in the United States is corn, which means we have to keep account of the amount of fossil fuels being used to plant and harvest the corn crops, thus making ethanol a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It is not truly carbon neutral. Ethanol production is also expensive and thus not currently cost competitive. The United States ethanol industry is right now propped up with a 51-cent per gallon government subsidy, which distorts the true cost of the fuel. And the fact that corn is the major source means that it also inflates the price of other commodities linked to corn. Now, it's often noted that in Brazil, they have a working ethanol industry. So how do they do it? Well, theirs is fed by sugarcane. And sugarcane has a much higher amount of sugars, so you don't have to do as much of the breaking down into simple sugars that are then fermented. But the total area of the world that can be devoted to sugarcane farming is not extensive, so don't expect Brazil's success story to be translated everywhere. Now, researchers are looking carefully at the most abundant organic compound in the world, and that is cellulose, as a fuel stock for ethanol production in the future. And if we could do this more efficiently, that might be worthwhile. Now, cellulose from wood, or switchgrass, or straw, or corn stover, which are the portions of corn plants that are not edible and thus will not drive up food prices, these could be the saving grace for ethanol. Though cellulose is a complex polysaccharide composed entirely of glucose, evolution has managed to arrange that glucose in a manner that is incredibly difficult to break down. Plants wear cellulose like armor, and it is the goal of researchers right now to find a chink in that armor that will allow them to hydrolyze the cellulose into simple sugars. The main frontal attacks have been using heat or sulfuric acid or enzymes called cellulases, to try to break down the cellulose. The combination of heat plus sulfuric acid does work, but too much energy is consumed to make it worthwhile. Cellulases are currently just too expensive to use, and there are problems in scaling up their use to an industrial scale. But the research continues and marches on, so we'll keep an eye on that one for sure. Now, chemical conversion of biomass to biofuel centers around the use of fats in oils that are converted chemically into biodiesel. Now, biodiesel, this biofuel, is remarkably similar to petroleum-based diesel fuels and can be used in any diesel engine. The conversion process is really simple, too. You take vegetable oils, made up of these triglyceride fat molecules, in the presence of an alcohol and a catalyst at room temperature, and let the chemical process just run. And what you get are fatty acid esters and glycerin. The fatty acid esters are the biodiesel product, and your byproduct is glycerin, which you can biodegrade, or maybe it can be used in some other industrial application. The major disadvantage so far has been cost. Again, because vegetable oil production is costly, and vegetable oil production is also supported by a subsidy, a 50-cent to $1 per gallon subsidy in the United States. An exciting alternative to vegetable oil for this process is the use of algae to produce oils. Soybeans can produce about 48 gallons of vegetable oil per acre. Algae, when grown in shallow ponds that are carefully monitored or in clear plastic tubes, may have the potential of producing 10,000 gallons of oil per acre. Again, cost is a current barrier, because oil from algae is capital intensive, and the growing medium requires large amounts of water and nutrients. You can also make biodiesel by taking animal fats or vegetable oils and heating it in a hydrogen-rich environment in the presence of a catalyst to make renewable or green diesel. There's a joint venture between ConocoPhillips and Tyson Foods that's ramping up to produce large quantities of biodiesel by this method, which may be able to reduce the cost barrier by using Tyson's byproducts as the input and ConocoPhillips' established infrastructure to deliver the output. Now, the last method, the thermochemical conversion, involves heating biomass in either a low or no oxygen environment. If you take any cellulose, that abundant molecule, like from wood or grasses, and heat it to about 500 degrees Celsius in the absence of oxygen, you get pyrolysis oil, which can be burned in boilers in place of petroleum-based fuel oil. This process is known as fast pyrolysis. Alternatively, the cellulose can be heated to over 700 degrees Celsius in the presence of just a little oxygen and steam, and you produce a synthetic gas. This process is called gasification, and the product is often called syngas, a flammable carbon monoxide and hydrogen mix that can be burned in a boiler to drive a turbine or used by a solid oxide fuel cell to directly produce electricity. It can also be converted chemically into a liquid fuel. The big problem with syngas is that it also contains ash and tars that can clog up turbines and degrade the active chemicals in fuel cells. Again, research on how to overcome these problems marches on, and there's some stuff being done on my campus that is looking pretty hard at this issue. So seeing that solar is the main energy source for nature, biomimicry would suggest that we should put forth the most concerted effort into tapping into solar directly. The main problem so far with solar is, once again, cost relative to fossil fuel energy production. And it has not been competitive so far, but with the rising price of oil and the falling costs of solar and other alternative renewable sources, this is beginning to change. We're on the brink of really seeing maybe a new kind of energy economy. Still, the use of solar in its three basic forms, passive, active, and photovoltaic, so far make up only a small proportion of global energy consumption. Right now, here's the breakdown for global energy consumption. 37% comes from oil, 25% from coal, 23% from natural gas, so right there, 85% is coming from fossil fuels. 6% comes from nuclear, 4% from biomass, 3% from hydropower, 0.5% from solar heating, what we call passive and active solar heating. 0.3% from wind, 0.2% from geothermal, 0.2% from biofuels, and a mere 0.04% from solar photovoltaics. So what is the difference between this passive, active, and photovoltaic solar power? Passive solar is simply collecting solar radiation on sun-exposed surfaces and converting it to heat energy. For example, having south-facing windows in the northern hemisphere and letting the sun in to warm the interior of a building in the winter when the sun is lower on the horizon, but maybe having some awnings and shades to block the sun in the summer when you want to be cooler. That's passive solar. A normal greenhouse is a passive solar collector. Your car sitting in the sun with the windows rolled up is a passive solar collector. Passive solar has been used by humans for over 2,000 years at least, and it's a simple way to reduce heating energy bills. As a flip side to passive solar heating is the fact that some areas are just too warm, and you would save energy if you could reduce the dependence on air conditioning if the temperature could be lowered. Now, because of what we call the urban heat island effect, cities are often several degrees warmer than their surrounding rural areas. So Los Angeles has a cool communities plan, which estimates that they could lower the temperature of Los Angeles by about 3 degrees Celsius on average by planting 10 million trees, re-roofing 5 million homes, and painting a quarter of the roads. Now, the tree planting has already begun, not only to bring down temperature, but to clean the air in Los Angeles. But they are finding that many of the trees that have been planted or have been given out are dying from lack of water. So there's some limitations there. But it is a good idea to try to reduce the urban heat island effect however you can, so you can reduce dependence in hot areas on air conditioning. Solar energy can also be used not only for heating, but for lighting as well. And this isn't minor when you consider the fact that 22% of U.S. energy use is for lighting. You realize that well-planned architecture that takes advantage of solar radiation for lighting the interiors of buildings can lighten our energy consumption markedly. Now, active solar energy involves heating water or other fluids that are then pumped through a structure to redistribute the heat and maximize efficiency. A neat twist on this is when the heated fluids are pumped into large rock reservoirs below the house where the heat can be stored for later use. When you get excess heat in the summer, when you don't need it, you store it in the rock reservoir below the building. And in the winter, when solar is not supplying your needs, you tap into that warmed rock reservoir for the extra heat that you need. Photovoltaics capture photons of energy and then generates electricity directly using the photoelectric effect. And I see I'm running out of time, so we can't discuss that in depth. But these solar panels can be scaled for the job. You may have a solar-powered calculator that runs on a single small solar panel. There are also solar panel arrays that feed significant amounts of energy into the power grid. These solar panels can also be transportable and so used away from the grid if needed. Take a look at a picture of the International Space Station. Definitely away from the grid. The wing-like objects sticking off the side of that craft are solar panels. Now, the main hindrance to this type of energy generation is cost. Okay. Which can be several times that of conventional power production. But that gap, that cost gap, has been steadily eroding and decreasing over the years. And now, with many governments having incentives in many areas, you can now afford a solar panel system for your home that could pay for itself in about 5 to 10 years. We should also note that if subsidies were removed from the oil companies and given over to solar technologies, the cost difference would pretty much disappear. Okay? Now, here at the Colorado School of Mines, we are working on thin-film solar cells that may reduce the cost further. The most common solar panels use bulk or crystalline silicon solar cells with the average efficiency of conversion from solar to electricity at about 14 to 16%. It's the thickness of these materials that are being used that translates to the high cost. The thin films being developed at our campus are about 5 microns thick, which reduces material requirements by many orders of magnitude, and therefore the cost as well. The problem, of course, is efficiency. Now, in the lab, our teams have achieved 20% efficiency, but getting that efficient requires some high-tech materials that cost quite a bit. Presently, there's an amorphous silica film with about a 10% efficiency, which is the most commercially competitive configuration that we've developed so far. The work on our campus emphasizes the real goal of solar technology, and that is to balance cost and efficiency. There are some other nifty solar technology strategies, like putting mirror arrays out in the desert that all focus the solar energy to the top of a tower where maybe water is turned to steam, which drives a turbine generator to produce electricity, or the focused solar radiation drives temperatures over 2,000 degrees Celsius in a chamber with water in a combination with catalysts like zinc oxide or some organic catalyst in the absence of oxygen, so that water is split into hydrogen and oxygen, which can then be used in fuel cells to generate electricity. And on that note, I want to say something about fuel cells real quick. Fuel cells will not solve our energy supply issue. Fuel cells are an energy storage and converter mechanism and not an energy source. We have to use some other energy source to generate the hydrogen or other fuel needed to run a fuel cell. That being said, fuel cells are really cool in that they have high energy efficiency due to chemical energy being converted directly to electricity. They can also deliver power over a wide range to run anything from a cell phone to a power station. The emission from use is mainly water. You can place them off the grid, and so you can use them anywhere. And though they are not an energy source, the generation of hydrogen fuel that they predominantly use can come from many varied sources, and so have what we call fuel flexibility. Besides the fact that fuel cells are an energy storage and delivery device, not an energy source, the major problem with fuel cells is a chicken and egg issue in that hydrogen infrastructure needs to be built to make mass fuel cell production worthwhile. But no one wants to invest in building the infrastructure, the hydrogen gas stations, the production stations and pipelines or transport vehicles, unless there is a fuel cell market in place to depend on that infrastructure. But no one wants to start depending heavily on fuel cells if no infrastructure is in place to support it, so on and so forth. So clearly, this problem is not insurmountable, as the use of oil initially faced the exact same challenge. but it will probably take some amazing leadership from industry or top-down command control strategies from government. But back to solar. As stated before, its main barrier has been cost competitiveness with fossil fuels, but that is slowly eroding away by the rising price of oil. Moreover, just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 236 to 182 to remove subsidies to oil companies. That amounts to $18 billion per year in tax breaks for oil companies. And using that money instead to increase incentives for more research and implementation of solar, wind, and energy efficiency strategies. But if you're like me and think this is a definite step in the right direction, don't get your hopes up. The Bush White House has already threatened to veto it, and it is not even certain that Democrats who are backing this bill will get enough support in the Senate to bring it to a vote. I also supported the idea of a gas tax to be used to pay for more alternative energy resource, and I really wish we had it right now so we could lower the gas tax as the price of oil has risen and thus lower the economic impact that rising oil prices have been having on my country's recessing economy. Oh well. Using a gas tax to even out oil prices would also help alternative energy sources to compete, because we have this historically problem where we've seen that when oil prices are high, research in alternative energies gets funded, but when oil prices fall, then alternative energy research money dries up. And this is a major blow to research when you can't have a sustained funding. You know, okay, we get some funding now, but now we have to shut down the project. Now we can start up a project again. You know, it really disrupts research. So it'd be nice to have a more consistently priced fossil fuel industry so we can have a more consistently funded alternative energy system as well. But besides these economic and political hurdles for solar, there are some other issues at hand as well. For example, most solar energy comes in the summer and during the day. Unfortunately, peak energy demands come in the winter and at night. Clearly, solar must be coupled with an efficient energy storage device to become viable. Many photoelectric panels can be hooked directly into the electric grid so that when they are at peak production, energy is going to flow from the solar panel operator into the grid, and your meter will actually run backwards. But when the sun is down, then the owner can tap into the grid and use what power is needed, and the meter runs forward again as usual. So right now the holy grail is solar energy as our primary energy source, with fuel cells as the primary storage and conversion device. There is also the problem that solar is inconsistent because of the fact that our atmosphere has these clouds that occasionally block the sun. Clearly, solar will not be a reasonable solution for cloudy areas like, Seattle or London. But for places in the United States like New Mexico, Arizona, portions of Colorado, Utah, Nevada, California, those look great for developing solar energy as a major base for their energy needs. But with current efficiencies, we would still need really large tracts of land to collect enough solar radiation to supply the demands that we have. And that will cause ecological disturbance of its own. So there is plenty of work to be done here. Solar is the primary energy source for the biosphere. It's also the most abundant and reliable form of non-polluting, truly renewable energy on this planet. It is the holy grail of our future energy supply line, but the preceding discussion should make clear that we can't expect it to work 100% for everyone everywhere. There are many approaches to harnessing renewable energy, and this has been a very truncated discussion. I know I've gone a lot longer than a lot of my other podcasts, but this has been incredibly truncated on the topic. I've had to drop whole strategies like thermal differential engines, but my goal is to make the point that each location may be best served by a select suite of solutions, depending on the natural and industrial environment available at each site. We must beware of these top-down mandates that dictate that everyone in a region, a country, a state, or maybe even a city take the same approach to energy independence. I think a great job title for the future would be Energy Portfolio Planner. Going to different areas and looking at the benefits and disadvantages of each individual situation and building up a list of the best long-term package of non-polluting, economically competitive, renewable energy sources for that place for their near future. An obvious theme running through this lecture is that solutions must not only be environmentally sensitive, but also economically viable. When we come back next time, we will be looking more carefully at environmental economics. Again, looking for solutions to our potential problems of climate disruption, resource depletion, and biodiversity loss. No doubt about it, this is an exciting time to be alive. Thanks for joining me once again, and I'll see you here next time on the Earth and Environmental Systems Podcast. Take care.
Don't you know about your fingertips away? There's a universe of atoms that thinks you're real something. Don't you know just a couple of lips away is an evolutionary being feast whose insides are jumping? Don't you know we're all light?
The Earth and Environmental Systems Podcast is a personal production of Dr. Christian Shorey and is modeled around lectures given at the Colorado School of Mines. For more information about the School of Mines Department of Geology and Geological Engineering, please visit mines.edu/academic/geology. Any inquiries regarding the podcast can be sent to Shorey, CSHOREY, at mines.edu. Thanks for listening, and remember to enjoy your planet.